just a quick reminder, this is the version of the Old Testament that I'm using mostly this session for all the texts of Exodus anyway. And then I do lean heavily on Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. And just so there's no confusion, again, this time, there'll be times today I'll be talking about the text of Exodus, but then there'll be other times when I'm talking about ancient Jewish interpretations of the text, which they may have embellished some. So it's not, some of it is from what we call midrash, and some of it is from the text itself.
So it's not from what we call midrash, and some of it is from the text.
I'm going to just get out and
get out.
Okay. All right. So here we go. Exodus chapter 3. This is probably one of the richest chapters in the entire Old Testament. You could fill certainly bookcases, if not a library, on the material that is just in chapter 3. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of moments that have big significance on the rest of the story of the scriptures. So I'll try and keep it to a slow roar here. But here's the beginning of Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the Midianite priest. He had driven the flock to the far side of the wilderness and come to God's mountain, to Horeb. Yahweh's envoy appeared to him in a fiery flame out of the middle of a bush. He saw, and there the bush was burning up with fire, but the bush wasn't consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside and see this great sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see. A couple things to notice here. We have Moses' father-in-law, and he's got a different name than he did in the last chapter. In the last chapter, Moses' father-in-law's name was Reuel, and here it's Jethro. Later in the Old Testament, he will be called Hobab. In another place, Kenny. In another place, Putiel. What is the deal here? Why does this one person have so many names? It appears that Jethro is the main name. It appears the most out of all of them. It appears 9 times in the Old Testament. Ancient Jewish commentators, these are the rabbis who do the midrash, say that Jethro had 7 names, and that in the ancient world, a name was meant to capture the essence of a person, which is why so many times in the Old Testament, someone will be named something for a particular reason, just like Moses is named Moses because Masha means that he had been drawn out. And so ancient Jewish commentators say that Jethro must have been a very complicated person to have so many essences, to have been displayed in so many names. Whatever is going on here, we definitely at least have multiple oral traditions coming together into one written textual tradition. Some people knew him as Jethro, some people knew him as Reuel, some people knew him as Hobab, etc. We are again confronted with him being a priest, and a pagan priest at that. Again, this is one of those things where I wonder why the author of Exodus had to say this so many times. Couldn't this have been a little detail that they just could have left out? Ancient Jewish commentators, and so again, we're stepping away from the text. The ancient Jewish tradition said that he was a pagan priest who went into the wilderness of Midian to convert to worshiping the one true God. They say that this is why his daughters were attacked at the well, because he was unliked by the surrounding populace because he was rejecting their gods. It's interesting. It's an interesting little tag. I don't think it has any historical merit whatsoever, because monotheism really doesn't become a viable thing until after the Exodus. Do I think at the end of his life was he a monotheist and following the God of Moses? Certainly, but almost certainly not before his son-in-law became so close with God. So what does it mean that this bush wasn't consumed? Perhaps you might have read my article in the Lion's Roar, which I take from this. It came out a few hours ago. So fire is a normal, regular, prolific metaphor for the presence of God. One of the ways that you know that God is showing up is that God shows up in fire. And we see this throughout the Old Testament. It is one of the reasons why in our tradition, at the very beginning of worship, we light candles. And the last thing we do in a worship service is we extinguish the candles, because those little flames of fire represent the presence of God among us while we gather to worship. So this could just simply be God showing up as fire, just because that's one of the ways that God shows up. And, but it's not just a normal fire, it's a special holy fire. And so the bush isn't being consumed. And it also becomes something of a curiosity that makes Moses go over and see it. Things on fire, and things catch on fire in the wilderness, either because someone's careless or because a lightning strikes something. So something being on fire in the wilderness might not have gotten Moses's attention too much, but something being on fire but not being consumed, that might have definitely got his attention to go over and see what was going on. So that's one way that we can see the burning bush. It's just the presence of God in this strange and holy way that got Moses' attention. There is another tradition. So in Isaiah 43, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. The 4th chapter of Deuteronomy, but the Lord has taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own possession, as at this day. From 1 Kings, for they are thy people and thy heritage, which thou didst bring out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Jeremiah 11, cursed be the man who does not heed the words of this covenant, which I commanded your fathers when I brought them out of the land of Egypt from the iron furnace. Fire becomes a frequent metaphor for the trials of Israel in Egypt and in Babylon. Remember, they're slaves in Egypt, and then about 900 years later, they're slaves in Babylon. And one of the ways that that the Old Testament speaks of both of those enslavements is that they are like trials of fire. It's like being in a furnace. But although they are in fire, they are not consumed. They're able to walk through this fire. And so the burning bush could also be seen as a metaphor for sort of a foreshadowing that Israel will not be consumed. It will not be burnt up. It won't be burned up in Egypt. It won't be burned up in Babylon. We could extend that to say that though we walk through times that feel like we're walking through an iron furnace, we too will not be burned up. We will not be consumed. There was a guy, J. Gerald Jansen, who wrote a paper on this, and he said he was in New York City, and he was walking into one of the, I think it was a library of one of the Jewish universities, and he's over the door it said "burned but not consumed," and it made him realize that the bush was about something larger, that God's people, we are not promised that we are not going to go through trials ever. We are definitely going to be tried. We are going to know pain and loss and all of that, but we will not be consumed. In the Midrash Rabbah, which is an ancient Jewish document from about 400 AD to about 1000 AD. There's a bunch of, it's almost like a little compendium. This is one of the quotes from it. Why did God show Moses such a symbol? Because he, Moses, had thought to himself that the Egyptians might consume Israel. Hence did God show him a fire which burnt but did not consume, saying to him, just as the thorn bush is burning and is not consumed, so the Egyptians will not be able to destroy Israel. Notice the theme of seeing continues here. Moses saw the bush. He must turn aside and see this great sight. Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see. There's that whole theme of looking upon just continues from the first chapter through the second chapter, and now in the third chapter. God called to him out of the middle of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. He said, I'm here. He said, don't draw near. Take your boots off your feet, because the place you're standing on is sacred ground. And he said, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The word there where Moses replies to God saying, I'm here, in Hebrew, that word is hineni. Hineni, one word. And it is one of the most important words of the Old Testament. When God calls out to a prophet and starts speaking to them, the prophetic response is always, here I am, Lord. Hineni. You're here, and I'm here with you. It's a loaded word. Whenever we sing in church, here I am, Lord, it is I, Lord, I have heard you calling in the night. That is based off of the Hebrew word hineni. I am here. He's on holy ground. This is one of those bits that, entire book cases could be filled with what has been written about the holy ground around the burning bush. I've heard one interesting interpretation say that when God said that to Moses, he didn't just mean the ground around the bush, but that he meant the whole created order, that every place is holy ground. I don't think that's what was intended here in Exodus chapter 3, but it is an interesting thought. Why take off the shoes? So you could, I think the traditional reading of that is that it's holy ground, and to wear shoes would be disrespectful, sort of like wearing a hat, a man wearing a hat in church, or wearing a hat in a building where the American flag is flying. That's disrespectful. You don't do that. And I think you could certainly look at this passage from this perspective. There is another way, though. Shoes protect us from the ground. If you've ever gone out in the morning to go get the newspaper and you're in your bare feet, you feel every pebble, every little, bit of glass, every little rock. If you've ever gone to the beach, you might have walked on the hot sand and and you try and bury your feet in the sand to keep them cool. If you walked outside today, unless you're in Arizona, but if you walk outside tonight in bare feet, your feet are going to be cold. Shoes protect us from the heat, from the cold, from the rocks, from the pebbles, from the sand, from the bugs, and all of that. Might it be that God didn't want him protected from this ground? Might it be that God wanted him to experience the whole thing? This ground is holy, can mean set apart. It can also mean like more, like it is what it is, but it's sort of amped up to 10. And so here's a place that God really wants Moses to experience every little bit of it. I think it's an interesting thing to consider. Moses hides his face from God, just like Adam and Eve hid their face from God. They tried to hide their nakedness from God when they had eaten of the tree they shouldn't have. And don't we all try and hide ourselves from God at some point? Aren't there things that we would rather God not know? Which is why one of the reasons in our tradition, when we begin a worship service, we begin with the collect for purity, remembering that to God all hearts are open, all desires known, and from God no secrets are hid. We can't hide from God, we say. A little bit longer of a section. Yahweh said, I really have seen my people's humbling in Egypt, and I've listened to their outcry on account of their bosses. Because I've acknowledged their sufferings, I've come down to rescue it from the hand of Egypt and take it up from that country to a good wide country, a country flowing with milk and syrup, to the place of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. So now here, the Israelites' outcry has come to me. I've also seen the affliction that the Egyptians are imposing on them. So now go, and I'll send you to Pharaoh to get my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So last week we had, towards the end of the second chapter, we had that series of action verbs where God acknowledged, saw, heard what was going on in Egypt to his people. And we see this again here at the beginning of this section. God saw, God listened, God acknowledged. And then in response to those actions, I have come down. I can't help but think about the traditional view of the family in the car driving off on vacation, and the kids are messing around in the back seat, and the parent turns around and says, don't make me come back there, right? God had to come back there. God came down, and it's in response to what he saw, listened to, and acknowledged. We have here God reveals sort of the full plan. This isn't just a rescue from Egypt. This isn't just a rescue from slavery in Egypt. It's a rescue from Egypt and the giving of a new home. So it's not just that, Pharaoh's not going to enslave them anymore, but they're just going to continue living in Egypt, and that's that. But they're going to be freed. They're going to leave, and the plan is they get a new land, a land that is rich, a land that is desirable, and God acknowledges right up front that it is not an empty land. It is a land full of other people, and they are going to have to evict the current residents from the land. We won't, I don't think, get to that really in this study, but I'm assuming you all know the story. At the end, there are a few more actions. The cry of the people came to God. So God heard the cry, and God saw the affliction. So again, we have, the different senses by which God sees it, God hears it. And this time, the response, the last time, the response to all the actions is God came down. This time, what happens following all of the action verbs is Moses is to go. Moses is to go to Egypt to get my people. That last line there, Pharaoh, to get my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. There's a divine claim on this slave people. It's not just get the people or get your people or get some people. These are my people. There's a real sense of intimacy there. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and get the Israelites out of Egypt?" He said, "Because I will be with you. This will be the sign for you that I've sent you. When you get the people out of Egypt, you'll all serve God on this mountain." So the standard prophetic call scene, we see it with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Gideon, and Moses is probably the best example of it. When God comes down to give someone a job, the first thing the person does is say, "You got the wrong guy. I'm not doing that. What are you, crazy?" And they have some series of reasons why they shouldn't do it. So they argue with God about this. This is Moses's first response. We're going to see a second response tonight, and then we're going to see several more next week. So his first response, the first sort of rebuttal to this is, who am I? Who am I? Why me? So historically, within Judaism, this can be read in two ways. The first is probably the standard Christian view of looking at this too, is that Moses is just too humble, right? Like Moses is too humble and lowly to go on such a mission, to represent such a God, to go for such a people, to go before Pharaoh, this incredibly important and powerful figure. Who am I? I've just been watching sheep for the last 40 years. Before that, I was a murderer. Like, my resume isn't quite up to date. Who am I to do this? That's one way of seeing it. And that's probably the predominant way of seeing it. The other strong thread of interpretation on this from the Jewish perspective is that it's not that Moses thinks that he's unworthy. The alternate view is that Moses thinks that the people are unworthy, that Moses is too noble to rescue such a wayward people who don't deserve a rescue. The people are not worthy. They are not fit for redemption. This sort of sort of calls back to the earlier sessions where we looked at, was their enslavement their fault, right? Remember that? Had they forgotten who they were? Had they assimilated? Had they stopped circumcising? Had they left the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and served Egyptian gods? This line of interpretation comes straight out of that tradition. While this would be certainly, at least in Christianity, the minority view, if you do look forward in the story a bit, when they finally do get redeemed from Egypt and they go to the wilderness and Moses goes up on the mountaintop and he's receiving the 10 Commandments from God, what are the people doing down below? They're making a golden calf, right? The first thing they do with their newfound freedom, won for them by their own God who calls them my people, the first thing they do is they make an idol and they bow down and they worship it. And so if Moses here indeed was thinking that the people are unworthy of redemption, by the time they get to Mount Sinai, wasn't he right? Doesn't it kind of look like they don't quite deserve what they got? So if you look at the whole story, there might be something to that. Notice that God completely brushes it off. Moses says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" God says, "I'll be with you," which doesn't really answer the question at all. It kind of reminds me of the New Testament when Jesus is asked question after question after question, and like 98% of the time, Jesus does not answer the question. He's like, I'll tell you a story, I'll ask you a question, I'll ignore the question. But here, God doesn't quite answer what it is that Moses is saying. Oh no. Okay, here we go. Moses said to God, here's the big one. We're going to be here for a few moments. Moses said to God, "Here, I'm going to come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors, he has sent me to you, and they will say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I will be what I will be." He said, "Say this to the Israelites, I will be sent me to you." God said further to Moses, "Say this to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, sent me to you. This is my name permanently. This is my designation to all generations." So Moses' second response to God, his second way of kind of like weaseling his way out of this tremendous thing that God is trying to put on him, is Moses is like, "I don't know your name. When I go to the Israelites, when I go to Pharaoh, and I say I met a God in a bush, they're going to say, what God? What is this God's name? We have lots of gods, and I don't know. So I don't think I'm the right guy to do this." To answer this, God answers directly. And God gives his name. And this is where things get a little complicated. So we're probably all familiar with Yahweh, and we get there. In a few verses, it says, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But before that, God said to Moses, "Here, I will be what I will be." There, it does not say Yahweh. In the Hebrew, that's not Yahweh. In Hebrew, that is Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh. Ehyeh is in the imperfect tense, meaning when something's imperfect, it means it hasn't been completed. And so a word in the imperfect might not yet have been completed. It might have already been completed, or it might be completed someday. And so the translation here could be, I am that I am, or it could be, I was who I was, or it could be, I will be who I will be, which is what Goldingay chose to for this translation. So, but then things get complicated. Say this to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors. So is God's name Ehyeh, or is God's name Yahweh? Which is it? And just to make it a little more complicated, nope. Well, I don't have it. It says Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. That word is another name for God that's used throughout the Old Testament. That word is Elohim. In fact, when you open up your Bible to the first page, the first chapter, Genesis chapter 1, the first time we ever see God, God is known by the name Elohim. So we have Ehyeh, we have Yahweh, and we have Elohim here. So here's, oh, I don't believe it. Okay, I thought, sorry. So Ehyeh is what means I am that I am, or I will be what I will be, or I was what I was. Ehyeh is the name to be in the first person. I am. Yahweh is the same verb, but it's in the second person. He was, he is, he will be. So when what's God's name? Well, I don't say God is I am because I'm Rick. What's God's name? He is. So we see it's kind of wild. We see God, when God presents his name, he presents it in the first person and in the second person, which just goes to show. And what does it mean? I am, I will be, I might already be, I was who I was. There's like all these layers of mystery surrounding this name, which is kind of what you would expect from a real, honest God. God says at the end of here, this is my name permanently. This is my designation to all generations. It seems like the intent here at the burning bush, when God gives his name, is that that's what God expects us to use for him. This is my name. This is my name permanently. This is my designation to all generations. This is the name you use. And it has not been used. I mean, how many times a year do you say the word Yahweh? And how many times a year do you say the word God? My guess is you say the word God a lot more than Yahweh. And God is not his name. God is just what God is. His name is Yahweh, or Ehyeh. What he is God. This goes back to the Jewish tradition, and Christianity just followed along in this respect. The third commandment is, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And what our brothers and sisters in the Jewish faith did was they protected that name at all cost. And so they said, we're not going to say this name, because if we say it, we might be blaspheming. And so we're not going to say it. We're not going to write it. We're going to come up with other things to call God. We are not going to use this name because we do not want to blaspheme God. I've told the story a couple times of the Dead Sea Scrolls. When you look at them, you can tell when it says Yahweh, because the font they use in the Dead Sea Scrolls is like 2 or 3 times the size of everything else around it. So when the person was reading it, they didn't by mistake say the word Yahweh. They would say the name or the Lord. We do this in Christianity too. I mean, obviously we say God far more than we say Yahweh. I can't think of a single prayer in the Book of Common Prayer that is directed to Yahweh. It's God or Jesus or the Holy Spirit. In Christian Bibles, you'll see in the Old Testament the word Lord show up. And sometimes it's written normally with a capital L, but sometimes it's a capital L and then a capital O, capital R, capital D, and they're sort of like small capitals. It's in the Bible, it's in the Psalter, in the Book of Common Prayer. Whenever you see that, the Hebrew word behind that isn't Lord. It's not a translation of the Hebrew word for Lord. It's Yahweh. It's a way that Jews and then Christians have tried to protect the name Yahweh when it seems like that doesn't seem like that's what God's intent was. God doesn't say to Moses here, I'm going to give you my name, but don't you dare use it. He says, this is my name permanently. And we just don't use it at all. Go, this is the last bit, go gather Israel's elders and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me saying, I really have attended to you and to what's being done to you in Egypt. I've said, I will take you up out from humbling in Egypt to the country of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, to a country flowing with milk and syrup. They will listen to your voice, and you are to come, you and Israel's elders, to the king of Egypt and say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, he's met with us. So now we must please go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice for Yahweh, our God. So Moses is supposed to first go to the Israelites and tell them the plan. We're getting rescued. We're getting out of here. We're getting a new country. Then he tells Moses that he's to go to Pharaoh and tell them, hey, we need a few days off. We need to go and into the wilderness and sacrifice to God. So it seems like God doesn't want Moses to be perfectly truthful with Pharaoh here, which is kind of interesting, knowing everything that's going to come to pass, because they're not just wanting to go 3 days out in the wilderness. They're getting out of there. They're getting a new land. It's flowing with milk and syrup, and everything's going to be great. What God says to Moses to say to Pharaoh is, he's met with us. God has met with them. There's a sort of a double-edged sword here. There's an implicit intimacy. Like, I don't know about you, Pharaoh, what your gods do, but our God meets with us. But there's also an implicit threat that this God is on our side. And he's so on our side that this God comes and meets with us. And so you better do what we say, or else. Of course, Pharaoh will not listen to what they say, and so or else will come to pass. I'm sorry. I thought that was the last bit. This is the last bit. I myself acknowledge that the king of Egypt won't allow you to go, not even because of a strong hand. But I shall put out my hand and strike Egypt down with all the extraordinary things that I shall do among them. After this, he'll send you off, and I shall give this people grace in the eyes of Egypt. When you go, you won't go empty-handed. A woman will ask from her neighbor and from the woman residing in her house for objects of silver and objects of gold and clothes, and you will put them on your sons and on your daughters. You will strip Egypt. So God is upfront with Moses. We got a plan. Pharaoh's never going to go with the plan. You're going to go talk to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's not going to be on board. But he will strike Egypt down. Eventually, this plan will come to pass. And God reveals just one more detail of the larger plan, and that is that they are going to strip Egypt for parts. They are going to take just about everything that is precious in Egypt out of Egypt for their own use. We will see all of this gold, silver, and precious items be put to use primarily in the tabernacle. Once they get in the wilderness, after the 10 Commandments are given, God says, I want you to build me a mobile sanctuary, a mobile place of worship, and it's going to require a lot of gold and silver, a lot of precious items. And you don't have to go fishing for it. You don't have to go digging for it because you already got it. You took it out of Egypt. So I'm getting you out of here. I'm getting you your own land, and you're going to go with your hands full.